So today I'm going to start talking about, I'm not sure how many videos it's going to take, but I'm going to talk about the devastation of the authority of the Catholic Church in Europe and how that led into the Great Rebellion, which included the Protestant Reformation right in the middle of all of that. That means we'll be talking about the Great Famine of Europe, from starting with 1315, and then the Black Plague, or the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. Then that together with the Great Famine undermined that authority and led into the three-staged Great Rebellion, which included the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, which undermined the authority of all of Western society and established the individual man in society with his or her own authority being developed over this time. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how that fits in with the Bible and Christianity, and how that fits in with Revelation and everything else that comes out of the Scriptures to inform us of these things. All right, so let's get started with the Great Famine of 1315. So we're going to be reading mostly simply from Wikipedia. We're just going to read from Wikipedia and see what we find, and we'll start from there. The Great Famine of 1315. So here it is. So let me get my glasses and I'll be ready. And here we go. So the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, occasionally dated 1315 to 1322, was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck Europe early in the 14th century. Most of Europe, extending east to Russia and south to Italy, was affected. The famine caused many deaths over an extended number of years and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the 11th to the 13th centuries. So for 200 years, it had been growth and prosperity in Europe. That includes also growth in the population. There's a period that was called the warm period of Europe, and that caused the crops to grow very well and fed a lot of people. People multiplied in population. Okay, so that was for about 200 years. The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest of 1317, and Europe did not fully recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. Infanticide is killing your children. The crisis had consequences for the church, state, European society, and for future calamities to follow in the 14th century. So they're saying the same thing I did, was that, this was the beginning of the undermining of the authority of Western society, European society. And it wasn't only this, but the following crisis as well. So let's jump down here. Well, we can see here, all right? So famines were familiar occurrences in medieval Europe. For example, localized famines occurred in France during the 14th century in these years. Look how frequently it was. The Great Famine was right in the middle there. And then, wow, a lot more. And then in England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the Great Famine, there were additional famines in 1322, 51, and 69. For most people, there was often not enough to eat, and life was a relatively short and brutal struggle to survive to old age. Old age meant about 30. According to official records about the English royal family, an example of the best off in society, for whom records were kept, the average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was 35 years. Between 1301, that's only 25 years later, to 1325, so 25 to 50 years later, during the Great Famine, it was only 30 years. So from 35 to 30 years, 5 years was cut off. That was from the best off in society. While between 1348 and 1375, during the plague, the Black Plague, it was only 17 years. Can you imagine expecting only to live 17 years? That means you would have to have children before you died. at 15 and 16. Because if you didn't, you had no offspring. And if everyone died at 17, there'd be no people left if they didn't have children earlier. It demonstrates the relative steep drop between 1348 and 1375 of about 42%. During the medieval warm period, the period prior to 1300, the population of Europe exploded compared to prior eras, reaching levels that were not matched again in some places until the 19th century. That's the 1800s. So for 500 years, the levels were not reached again. Indeed, parts of rural France today are still less populous than at the beginning of the 14th century, the 1300s, before the famine. So even parts of France have never recovered. Never. So it says, however, the yield ratios, this is what's interesting. However, the yield ratios of wheat, which means the number of seeds one could eat per seed planted. So you plant one seed, out of it you get how many seeds that you can eat. Okay? Had been dropping since 1280. So even before, the production of the wheat had been dropping already, the fruitfulness of it. And food prices had been climbing. After favorable harvests, the ratio could be as high as 7-1, but after unfavorable harvests, it was as low as 2-1. That means for every one seed planted, you had 7 seeds that could be used. Or one seed planted, you had 2 seeds that could be used. Okay? Harvested. And out of those 2 seeds, one of them had to be for the next year's harvest or crop, right? So you had to save 1 out of the 2 seeds. That was the worst situation. If you had 7, you saved 1 out of the 7. You could eat 6 of them. By comparison, modern farming has ratios of 30-1 or more. Wow. The onset, I mean, it's wow, but then you think about it, you go, well, hold on a minute. Shouldn't we have like 300-1? I mean, compared to their 7-1? Because 7-1 and 30-1, that's only a 400, that's only like 400%. It's a 300% increase. That's it. And we're supposed to have this super technology and super science and super knowledge about everything and diseases and production and soil and everything. And we only have a 300% increase over the time before the Black Plague. I mean, when I thought about that, I thought, that's horrible. That's really horrible. We should be far ahead of that. So, yeah. The onset of the Great Famine coincided with the end of the medieval warm period between 1310 and 1330. Northern Europe saw some of the worst and most sustained periods of bad weather in the entire Middle Ages, characterized by severe winters and rainy and cold summers. The Great Famine may have been precipitated by a volcanic event, perhaps that of this mountain in New Zealand, which lasted about 5 years. Changing weather patterns, the ineffectiveness of medieval governments in dealing with crises, and population level at a historic high made it a time for little margin of error in food production. So they were overtaxed in the number of people they had compared to how much food they were making, and their technology to be able to deal with diseases, crop diseases in particular. And so there's not much you can do about crop diseases when you're beleaguered by rain, storms and rain. Where are you going to dry things? If it's always rainy and wet, where will you dry things? It's going to get smut and mold, and it's going to be useless. You can't eat it. And the cattle and sheep can't eat it either. And so what happens is they starve as well, along with the people. And when you get starving organisms, they are weaker, which means that they're more susceptible to diseases. And once the disease enters the population, it spreads very easily, especially when a large portion of the population are weakened. If it enters through some of the weakened organisms, it will travel across the weakest organisms first and infect some of the stronger organisms along the way. So weakening them or killing them. And if they're weakened, well, then they're going to get infected with even other diseases. So it's a situation where one thing leads to the other. So when you get famine, You've got to take care of it right away if you can. Because if you don't, you will have disease attack the population of animals and humans. And when it attacks the animals, the humans become even weaker because they lose more of their food. They have less food to eat even then. And society breaks down because people start eating people. Or killing their young so that they can survive, so they have food to eat. They might not eat their young, but they kill them so they don't have to feed them. Or just deprive them of food till they die and eat what little they have. Or the other way around. The older will hold off eating in order for the younger to eat. So, yeah, society breaks down in that way. There are many ways society can break down. And so that's why we have to be very, very careful with these things. Management in times of crisis, how do you manage something like that? Well, when you had an overabundance of food, rather than, creating more population and eating it all, it would have been good to put some away, right? And where do you put it away in order to store it so it stays dry? Well, you need a silo or something like that. And even then, you might not be able to because of the intense rain and weather that hits you. All right, so the Great Famine. In the spring of 1315, unusually heavy rain began in much of Europe. Throughout the spring and the summer, it continued to rain, and the temperature remained cool. Under such conditions, grain could not ripen, so the grain wasn't even ripening, leading to widespread crop failures. Grain was brought indoors in urns and pots to keep dry. The straw and hay for the animals could not be cured because there was no sun. And it was not hot weather. So there was no fodder for the livestock, food for the livestock. The price of food began to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. Just a few months, the price of food doubled. It says, salt, the only way to cure and preserve meat, was difficult to obtain because brine could not be effectively evaporated in wet weather. Its price increased from 30 to 40 shillings. In Lorraine, wheat prices grew by 320%, making bread unaffordable to peasants. Stores of grain for long-term emergencies were limited to royalty, lords, nobles, wealthy merchants, and the church. Because of the general increased population pressures, more population, more people, even lower than average harvests meant some people would go hungry. So even a little bit lower than average harvest, some people would not be able to eat. There was little margin for failure. People began to harvest wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark in the forests. A number of documented incidents show the extent of the famine. Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans in the 10th of August 1315 and had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. It is a rare occasion in which the King of England was unable to eat. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but in low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became so bogged down that they were forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they left them, unable to carry them away. So they're just illustrating from these stories how wet it had gotten. So you can understand how the crops would be failing across Europe. In the spring of 1316, it continued to rain on a European population deprived of energy and reserves to sustain itself. All segments of society, from nobles to peasants, were affected, but especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and who had no reserve food supplies. So the wealthy may have had some reserve food supplies, but the peasants didn't, and that was 95% of the people. To provide some measure of relief, the future was mortgaged by slaughtering the draft animals, eating the seed grain, abandoning children to fend for themselves, and, among old people, voluntarily refusing food for the younger generation to survive. So the draft animals are the animals that did the work. You don't want to kill them, because they're the ones who are going to do the work of the crops. If you kill them, you have no animals to do the work of producing the crops. So you don't kill You don't kill the draft animals and eat them. But they did at that time. They were desperate. They ate the grain that was being saved for the next year to plant for the next year. What are you going to do next year when you have no seeds to plant? Or you've got 50% of the seeds to plant that you had planned? Abandoning children to fend for themselves. Abandoning the children and saying, good luck. That's it. What do you think the children are going to do? The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents of cannibalism, although one can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumor mongering. That's a very cynical modern perspective on historical chronicles, of severe suffering. These people who say these such things never suffered to such great extent. And when they hear it, they can't believe it. So they want to discount it in any way they can. I guarantee you during these times, there was cannibalism. Even in the 30s in Ukraine. Stalin sent his thugs down to steal the food from the Ukrainians to force them to hand it over to where the Ukrainians were starving. They were the ones producing the food, but they were starving. This is mostly eastern Ukraine. Some of them survived by eating the bark off of trees, boiling it until it was soft enough to eat. But others actually reverted to cannibalism. Many Western scholars refused to acknowledge that the Holodomor, that's what it's called, happened. They refused to acknowledge that it happened until only recently. That's the cynicism that rises up among intellectuals, the educated. And the more that we educate our children, the more cynical they become. And the more cynical they become, the less they believe in other people's sufferings. This is the downfall of society. This sets us up for a dictatorship, a tyrannical dictatorship. Horrible. We cannot become jaded and cynical about other people's sufferings, especially the worst of the sufferings, because that's the thing they tend to disbelieve first and foremost, like Holocaust deniers. Those rose up among the intellectuals, the leftist liberal intellectuals, whose heads are so puffed up they think they're God. You can't let education puff you up and make you prideful and make you think that you can judge anything and everything that you hear and see. There's so much you don't see. There's so much you don't know and you cannot know. You cannot know the thoughts in the heart of another person. You cannot. You have no access to it. You say, well, I can read it from them, speaking. There's a certain amount you can do, like you can see in my False Prophet series, but there's a lot more that you can't, that only God has access to. So we cannot be cynical about this. And we cannot be puffed up. We've got to be sober at all times. The height of the famine was in 1317 as the wet weather continued. Finally, in that summer, the weather returned to its normal patterns. But by then, however, people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten, that it was not until 1325 that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase again. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died, though the Black Plague, the Black Death, would kill more people, in fact 1 out of 2. It often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the population, the populace. So, the geography. The Great Famine was restricted to Northern Europe, including the British Isles, Northern France, the Low Countries, that's Flanders, Netherlands, etc., Scandinavia, Germany, and Western Poland. It also affected some of the Baltic states except for the far eastern Baltic, which was affected only indirectly. The famine was bounded to the south by the Alps and the Pyrenees, so it didn't enter into Spain or into Italy. So, let's look down a little bit more. The Great Famine is noteworthy for the number of people who died, the vast geographic area that was affected, and its length, but also its lasting consequences. That's what I want to focus on, the lasting consequences. The church. In a society whose final recourse for nearly all problems had been religion, and Roman Catholicism was the only tolerated Christian faith, no amount of prayer seemed effective against the root causes of the famine. No matter how much they prayed, that it didn't change the real cause of the famine. This undermined the institutional authority of the Roman Catholic Church and helped lay the foundations for later movements that were deemed heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, as they opposed the papacy and blamed the perceived failure of prayer upon corruption and doctrinal errors within the Roman Catholic Church. All right, so let's focus on this a minute. These later movements, which were labeled heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, they opposed the papacy and they blamed the failure of prayer, what appeared to be the failure of prayer, on the corruption of the clergy and on doctrinal errors within the Roman Catholic Church, that they had errors in their doctrine, and because of their corruption, that these two reasons, the prayers were not being answered by God. Very important to keep in mind. Cultural. Medieval Europe in the 14th century, that's 1300s when the famine happened, had already experienced widespread social violence, and even acts then punishable by death, such as rape and murder, were demonstrably far more common, especially relative to the population, compared with modern times. The famine led to a stark increase in crime, even among those not normally inclined to criminal activity, because people would resort to any means to feed themselves or their family. For the next several decades after the famine, Europe took on a tougher and more violent edge. So out of the famine and the suffering and the loss of the authority of the church over the people, violence arose. More violence and serious violence. Of course it did. Because if you have the moral authority over the people, and that authority's been eroded away by this great grand suffering where they couldn't do anything, that moral authority will not be listened to in the conscience of the individual. And they're going to be more likely to revert to violence. So you understand the dynamics there, right? It's important that the authority of the church and the clergy be in place, so that as they teach and warn about moral behavior, that the conscience carries that with them to keep them away from violence and criminal activities that hurt people, do damage to people's lives. It says it became an even less amicable place than during the 12th and 13th centuries. This could be seen across all segments of society, perhaps most strikingly in the way warfare was conducted in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, when chivalry ended, as opposed to the 12th and 13th centuries when nobles were more likely to die by accident in tournament games than on the field of battle. So get this, is that the rules of civility in warfare were abandoned. The 100 Years' War were far more brutal than warfare before. And why not? You had the moral authority undermined. And that actually was the reason for the wars, or one of the main reasons. But really the core reason was it was a challenge of the moral authority of the Catholic Church. Well, if you don't believe in the moral authority of the Catholic Church, then where is your moral authority from? Well, as a good Protestant, you would say, well, it's directly from God, or it's from the Bible. We don't need the authority of the Catholic Church. And all you're doing is you're spreading the propaganda that actually created those 100 Years' War. We don't need the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Hear yourself. We don't need the religious authority. We don't need the moral authority through this institution that was in society managing that. That's anarchy. It's like saying we don't need government. Why would we need government? If we don't need any of the church to be governing the moral institution of society, why would we need the government to govern the political institution of society? So if you're going to turn to anarchy in the religious realm, why not turn to anarchy in the political realm? And in fact, that's what the movement towards democracy was. There's a movement towards anarchy in the political realm. So it says the famine also undermined confidence in medieval governments for their failure to deal with its resulting crisis. And that culminated in the Enlightenment and the revolutions of that time. Those were political revolutions. So, I mean, you had this political turmoil already and lack of confidence in the governments, but it especially came to a head as the third and final stage of the Great Rebellion against the exousia. Remember, we talked about exousia. That's a word in Greek in the New Testament, and it refers to the authorities that have existed from long ago. And that's the authority that gives authority to governments and to people in power. And it's from God. And so when we oppose a manifestation of the exousia in society, we are opposing the authority of God that was given spiritually to mankind on the earth, humanity on the earth, and manifests itself in different institutions, individuals, and groups of people to govern, to have authority and govern. Because remember, Jesus came preaching the kingdom of God. That was his main message. Now, the word kingdom, literally in the Greek, means the royalty of God. Not literally not the physical kingdom or a place. It's referring to the royalty of God. Jesus came preaching that the royalty of God had arrived. So that's about the authority of God. Okay, so population. The Great Famine marked a clear end to an unprecedented period of population growth that had started around 1050. So 1050 to 1300, there's a huge population growth. This percentage-wise has never been matched. Although some believe growth had already been slowing down for a few decades, and that's possible because it already talked about the slowing down of the production of the grain, the famine was undoubtedly a clear end of high population growth. The Great Famine would later have consequences for future events in the 14th century, such as the Black Death, when an already weakened population would be struck again. Okay, so it's important to understand. In the 14th century, you had a double whammy. You had the Great Famine, and then you had the Black Death. And both of them worked together to destroy the authority of the Catholic Church. That was the 1300s. Jan Hus was at the end of the 1300s. I think he died in 1410. Jan Hus, he was one of the early reformers, 100 years before Luther. Luther's thesis was 1517, and the Diet of Worms against him was 1521 or 22. So you had this happen, and then within just a few decades after the Black Death, I mean, the Black Death was still going on. Black Death was going on until the 17th century in parts of Europe. So, I mean, this all led up to this, but it kept reminding people of the inability of the religious authority to deal with the situation spiritually. And my proposal is that the reason why they couldn't deal with it and their prayers were being unanswered was that they were sinning. They wouldn't stop sinning. The prayers of a righteous person are powerful and effective. You say, hold it, it's righteous man. No, it's not. It's anthropos, not ander. It's not the gender man, like male. It's anthropos, like human being, meaning one who looks like man, meaning both men and women. The righteous prayers, the righteous prayers of a human being are powerful and effective. If you're not righteous, the prayers of a righteous human being are powerful and effective. If you are not righteous in your actions, your prayers will not be answered. If they are, they can be, but as a rule, they're not. God makes exceptions and answers prayers even of unrighteous individuals. But if you are a righteous human being, your prayers will be effective. Their prayers were not effective. Therefore, one of two things. Either it was a Job scenario where it didn't matter if they prayed about it or not, that it still wouldn't have changed. And that didn't mean that they had sin. See, that was what his friends were suggesting. And they were wrong. Job was a righteous man. God himself said so. So it wasn't because of sin that he was suffering. And we know that because we had an insight into the court of God where Satan came and challenged God. And God gave him the reign to wreak havoc in Job's life, to test and prove Job's faithfulness to God. So suffering is not always something because, we sinned. But most of the time it is. Sometimes it's a testing of the faith. But it can also be because you're sinning. Stop sinning, and you will stop suffering. Until God wants to test you and prove that you're faithful. Then you might suffer again, but for a different reason. And you will sense the difference between these two. Because when you're suffering, if you are convicted of some sin that you haven't given up, some corner of your life that you've not relinquished to God, God will press on your conscience through the Holy Spirit and indicate it. If you bury it, if you turn your eyes, at that moment, you may forget about it and ignore it and never change it and continue to suffer. Even when that suffering's done, it'll be to another suffering. It's for the same reason. God is still trying to get your attention, still trying to get you to change your behavior, your actions, your thoughts. Stop it. Stop sinning. Now, if God is allowing you to suffer as a testing to prove how faithful you are to him, you will know that also. Because it will not be indicating something that's sinful or even questionable. Maybe you have a category of YouTube videos that you watch, like ASMR. Okay? Some people refer to that, it's very crude language, but I'm just going to be frank with you. They refer to it as titties ASMR. Because the women there show their cleavage so much that their breasts are practically hanging out of their clothes. Maybe you have subscribed to these channels. And God indicates this by allowing you to suffer. And then tenderly touching your conscience and pointing to that. And you look and you go, I don't see anything wrong here. Okay, well, I'll keep looking. Maybe there's something wrong that I need to change. And you just forget it. You ignore it. You treat it like God didn't point at it. If you subscribe to those channels, you have to unsubscribe. Not only that, go into the YouTube where they make the recommendations of videos, at the youtube.com homepage where they put up those videos. I'm sure that you're going to get lots of those ASMR still suggested to you. Take some time. take 20, 30 minutes and go through and mark, do not recommend this channel, do not recommend this channel, and also hit a couple of them not interested. Because not interested will say, oh, this category of thing I don't want to see. But do not recommend this channel stops them from promoting that specific channel to you also. Go take the time and just go through all the ASMR that they keep proposing for about 20 to 30 minutes. After that, you won't see a single one promoted. It's true of any category. If that's not the category that you have problems with and it's a different category, then you need to do it with that category. I'm giving it as an example because it's so popular. So this suffering that happens can happen because you're involved in sin. And you pray to God and you ask him to help with the suffering and ask him to help with the problem, and he doesn't help and he doesn't help, and suddenly it's God's fault. It's not God's fault. It's not God's fault. If you're involved in sin, even in a tangential way, even in a questionable way, where, well, maybe it's sin, maybe it's not. Why do you want to walk on the curb? Walk in the sidewalk. God put the sidewalk there for you to walk on. Walk on it. Don't walk on the curb and then get hit in the head by a mirror from an overhanging truck and get knocked into the street and run over by the truck. Are you stupid? Walk in the sidewalk. If there's something questionable, get rid of it. If you're not sure, stop it. Get rid of it. You really want to go to hell because you didn't get rid of something that was questionable? Stop doing something that was questionable? You knew what to do and what not to do. You say, yeah, but this is gray area, drinking alcohol. And get rid of it. If you know it's a gray area and not a white area, get rid of it. Stop it. Yeah, but I like smoking marijuana, and Jesus never said you can't smoke marijuana. So it's a gray area. You certainly don't think it's a white area. So get rid of it. Yeah, but smoking cigarettes, what's wrong with that? It's just smoking cigarettes. Yeah, except that you develop a physiological addiction to it. Not only that, you severely damage your organism. It's a gray area. Get rid of it. Ron, that's too harsh. Where's the joy in life if we can't smoke cigarettes and smoke marijuana and drink alcohol? If you want to do it, go do it, but you're going to hell. Go do it, but you're going to hell. And I've warned you. If that's your attitude, you will go to hell. Walk in the middle of the sidewalk. There's great joy in walking in the middle of the sidewalk. I walk in the middle of the sidewalk. I have great joy. If I start into something that's questionable, then God points it out. And what do? Gird up my loins. Say, whoa, hold on a minute. No. Can't have any of that. Step back into the middle of the sidewalk. Do it. All right, we'll continue with this in the next video. Remember to subscribe down below and like the video and share it on your Facebook and other social media. And then make a comment, whether a question or a comment. We read all of them and we try to respond to all. Get on over to our website, The Rooted Word, and start reading the translation and also the articles we've posted. It's at therootedword.com, therootedword.com. And may the Lord bless you as you seek him with all your heart.